From the Mumbai studios of Republic TV, it's time for Arnab Goswami on The Debate.
Ladies and gentlemen, over the years, we have brought you the finest global coverage on issue after issue of geopolitical relevance to India. Well, tonight I am coming to you with a special global panel. It's on the screen, viewers, as the Ukraine crisis escalates. I'm delighted to introduce, let me make the introductions before I go into the news report. From India, we have Kamal Sibal, India's former foreign secretary and former ambassador to Turkey, Egypt, France, and Russia. I think he is the ultimate voice on foreign policy on issues like this from an Indian perspective. And Kamal Sibal, you are also joined by Dov Zakim. He's former Undersecretary of Defense in the George W. Bush administration and currently senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies at Washington, D.C. That's for an American perspective. From London, I'm joined by Elizabeth Brough, who's a senior fellow at the AEI. She's joining us live from London. From Ukraine this evening on the Republic Media Network, we have Mr. Bogdan Nahailo. He's acting chief editor of the Kiev Post for a Ukrainian perspective tonight. And Mark Sleboda, from a Russian perspective tonight, international relations and security analyst on whether Putin is punching well over his weight and whether he could face dangerous consequences of this brinkmanship. From a Chinese perspective, remember NATO and America are making a determined bid to get China into this. Will China get into this? Will it exercise any influence over Russia? I'm joined by Victor Gao. He's chair professor of Soochow University, live from Beijing. And our long-standing panelist, Andrew K.P. Leung, independent China strategist, is live from Hong Kong tonight. So, ladies and gentlemen, this special edition is live from Hong Kong, Beijing, Moscow, Kiev, London, Washington, and New Delhi. And the one question everyone is asking is this: will Biden and Putin go to war? Here's the latest. Then we go to our global roundtable debate.
Думаємо, надіємося, що на краще. А з другого, якщо то будемо відбиватися, давати відповідь. Якщо це. Але надіємося, що нападу не буде.
The fears of these Ukrainian soldiers reflect the global fear of a war. Ukraine has become the epicenter of geopolitical conflict and the reset of global balance of power. The immediate crisis can be traced back to November 2021, when the Ukrainian president claimed that about 100,000 Russian soldiers are near the border.
Не цінуєте наше і своє життя. І у мирних містах без будь-якого ворога вмираєте сотнями, тисячами, не від кулі або снаряду, а просто тому, що не хочете вакцинуватись.
Tensions have soared in recent weeks. The United States and its NATO allies have sent reinforcements to Eastern Europe. Satellite images showing tanks and military vehicles at a training area in Russia, a few hours' drive from the border with Ukraine, have been released. Russia has repeatedly asserted that it is not considering war.
Добрый день. Начинаем наш. Аналогичным образом Дамаск характеризовал и действия США, сделав особый акцент на варварской. Со своей стороны мы уже неоднократно заявляли о том, что наша страна ни на кого нападать не собирается.
But Pentagon has revealed that 8,500 troops have been placed on heightened alert.
I made it clear to early on to President Putin that if he were to move into Ukraine, that there'd be severe consequences, including significant economic sanctions, as well as I'd feel obliged to beef up our presence, NATO's presence on the Eastern Front, Poland, Romania, etc.
The Biden administration that has reverted on Moscow's demands says the ball is now in Russia's court.
Well, again, Russia just got our responses yesterday. They made clear to us that they need a little time to study them. So from where we're standing, the ball is in their court, but we are ready for talks bilaterally, NATO, Russia, OSCE, whenever they are ready.
But the divide within Europe is getting wider.
Die deutsche Bundesregierung hat sich ganz klar darauf verständigt, dass wir keine letale Waffen, keine Waffenlieferungen in Krisengebiete schicken, weil wir diese Konflikte nicht noch weiter anheizen wollen. Und ich glaube, das ist auch in diesem Fall der richtige Weg.
Örneğin iki lideri arzu ederlerse ülkemizde bir araya getirerek barış ortamının yeniden tesisine giden yolu açabiliriz.
We're supplying defensive weapons, we're providing economic support, and we are urging Russia to desist from an incursion, and we're making it very clear that if they were to do that, there would be severe economic cost to Russia.
Beijing's position on the matter is being looked at closely, especially at a time when it is deepening ties with Russia and being called upon to intervene by America. India is closely monitoring the situation.
We call for a peaceful resolution of the situation through sustained diplomatic efforts for long-term peace and stability in the region and beyond.
The plausibility of India getting drawn into a conflict involving Russia, Ukraine, NATO, and perhaps China remains to be seen. And the question remains, is the trigger of the conflict NATO expansionism? Is it Russian provocation at a time when only 6% of its borders are covered by NATO nations? Or is the root cause of a desperate Biden administration looking for distraction from domestic failures? Whatever the reason, is a Biden-Putin spurred world war inevitable?
I'd like to go across to London first to Miss Elizabeth Braw. Everyone's threatening Miss Braw, everyone else, of consequences and the price they will have to pay. There is no clear de-escalation that's happening. Every day we hear of one more, conflict-ridden statement. Is there a danger in this prolonged state of tension of even a gust of wind taking things out of control?
Oh, there absolutely is, and that's the predicament we're in. That any small accidental provocation or even intentional escalation, but especially accidental provocation, could lead to a situation where countries get involved in the military way, and so we have sort of a motion towards more and more violence that is then hard to stop. And it's because so many countries have different opinions, different stances on this at the moment. There are so many little things that could go wrong that then will bring all these countries into the conflict. And that's what I'm really concerned about. And not to be alarmist, but that's how World War I started. I don't think this will lead to World War III, but nevertheless, it could lead to conflict that extends beyond Ukraine and Russia.
We never know where a conflict at this level goes. The frightening part of what's going on, ladies and gentlemen, is that almost everybody is getting sucked in. Those who are getting involved, those who are not getting involved, everybody is being told to take sides. Europe is divided. But, nobody's going to be spared the consequences of a global conflict. I'd like to go across to Ukraine. To Mr. Nahalo, who's acting chief editor of the Kiev Post. He's a senior journalist from Kiev. Are you preparing for war? Are the people of Ukraine preparing for war? We've seen some reports saying the people of Ukraine have lived with a heightened state of tension for far too long. They're sort of immune to it. What's the feeling on the ground?
The feeling on the ground is that they would like a deeper understanding of what's going on. We have been at war with Russia for 8 years. We are fearing a new incursion, a very serious one this time. The war is not between Biden and Putin. The war is between Ukraine and Russia and its imperialistic designs on Ukraine. And that is what has drawn in the others, because Putin wants to control Ukraine, not allow it to move westward as its people want, and therefore has made these ultimata, given these ultimata, unreasonable, with a fair element of brinkmanship and bellicosity, which has drawn in and united, for that matter, the rest of Europe. The Americans have been rather reluctant until about a week or 2 or 3 ago to take a very firm position. But with the raising of the heightening the tensions from Moscow, saying all or nothing, Ukraine will be ours, meaning it will be Finlandized, it will be neutralized, it will be beyond any blocks, it won't be allowed to join the EU or NATO. That is totally unreasonable. We're living not in the 19th century, we're living in a democratic world, and India, as the largest democracy, should know that. So what is Russia today, other than a would-be great state restoring itself? In what position is it to tell Ukrainians whether they should look west or east? The Ukrainians don't want to be part of Eurasia. They want to be part of Europe. That is their choice, and that should be respected. And this pressure, this military pressure, these cyber attacks, these wars by other means, energy, for instance, this is 19th century gunboat diplomacy and brinkmanship that has no place in today's world where international standards should be respected. Remember that Russia took Crimea. It has of eastern Ukraine. It occupies part of Ukraine at this stage. So Ukrainian people know what to expect, but they fear the worst because this time, this war is not going to be about small incursions in the east or the south. What Ukrainians fear are, targeted rocket strikes at the capital, for instance, to sow panic, to divide the country, and to make it clear to the West that Ukraine is untenable. You can't defend it. It is our zone. It is our backyard. So back off. Ukraine belongs to Russia. Well, that's imagine if Britain was to say that to India, say, you are part of our empire, and remember who you are, and come back to us. And what would you reply?
I think you make some very strong points there. It's only appropriate that I take an immediate response from Mr. Mark Sloboda, who's an international relations and security analyst in Russia and in Moscow. You see, I'm not clear why Russia is doing this, and because a lot of our viewers would want a little bit of background. Of course, Russia has been a great power. I think Putin wants to restore Russia to the greatness that was there under the USSR, and Putin personally believes that it is part of his own political and historical destiny to take Russia back to that level of influence. However, is it feasible, Mark? Is it feasible? Should the people of Ukraine not be allowed to decide their own destiny? And is there a feeling that maybe, just maybe, what Russia did by annexing Crimea in 2014 may not be possible in 2021 with Ukraine so easily? Mr. Sloboda, and would you like to respond to any of the points Mr. Nahailo made from Kiev?
Yes. First of all, full disclosure, my wife is Crimean. My in-laws live in Simferopol, and we have family all over East Ukraine, Donbass, Kharkov, Odessa. And of course, the root of the most recent cause of this crisis is the openly US-backed putsch in 2014, which overthrew the last legitimate democratically elected government of Ukraine. And the regime backed by the US since then has been repressing and mass murdering its own people in East Ukraine, in the Donbass, to a total of 14,000 dead at this point. It's very touching that the US and Europe are so concerned about Ukrainian sovereignty now. It's a pity when they were on the streets of Kiev openly supporting, cheerleading on violent elements and insurrection in the country to overthrow the government against the wishes of the majority of the people, as polls reported in the Kiev Post at the time showed that a majority of people in Ukraine were against the Maidan. Since then, there has been no legitimate government in Kiev, and that is the Russian position, until the regime there politically reconciles along the lines of the Minsk Accords, which have been enshrined in international law, in a UN Security Council resolution, with the people of East Ukraine, that they continue to try to forcibly reincorporate to their seizure of power in the country. And the problem with that is they have long lost their sovereignty since 2014. And what Russia is seeing is the de facto NATOization of Ukraine on the ground. 10,000 NATO, quote, trainers and advisors, quote, unquote, on the ground. We have seen the United Kingdom just today finalized with Ukraine plans to build naval infrastructure, code for bases in Ukraine.
Yes.
They are flooding the country with advanced weapons, and they have bought advanced combat drones from NATO member Turkey and have used them against the Minsk Accords to conduct airstrikes on their, quote, own people in the east of the country.
Are you creating a case? We see our friend from Ukraine, from Kiev, want to respond to you. Are you creating a case, a desperate case for war? Is what I'd like to say. Mr. Nahailo responding to you from Kiev.
Very quickly, let's not get into fake news and disinformation. The Russian troops are in Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine. That area has been ethnically cleansed. 1.5 million people have fled from that area. There are Russian troops on the ground there. There are Russian troops, there are Russian missiles in the Kaliningrad Oblast, in the Black Sea, in the Baltic Sea. That's the aggression. Poland, Ukraine, the Baltic states, and potentially Belarus when they get rid of Lukashenko. They don't want Russian dominance. They want to live in an empire anymore. You know, that's a 19th century Tsarist concept. We have a president that was elected, Russian-speaking, Jewish origin, elected by 73% of the voters in a size of democracy that in Russia is unheard of. Putin has been in power as an autocrat for how many decades? So come on, let's not pull the wool over our eyes and let's speak the truth and not what the Kremlin wants you to say.
You heard that, Mark? I mean, do you consider Ukraine an independent country?
I don't think the Ukraine has been an independent country since 2014.
But more simply put, do you consider Ukraine an independent country?
Ukraine has not been an independent country since 2014. And Joe Biden himself has bragged about having government officials that were actually investigating a company that his son was involved in a no-show corrupt job, removed from office. The Ukraine has no sovereignty. This is why Russia.
No, that's your interpretation of things.
States.
That's your interpretation of things.
That is the Russian government's interpretation.
Yeah, but the Russian government's interpretation cannot be unilateral, Mark. No. My question is, see, it's your interpretation, and there's a huge amount of self-righteous indignation that you have over the issue. But it's your interpretation and it's your indignation.
My family is on the line in East Ukraine. I do.
No, I do understand. But the point is, but the point is, see, you know.
Tell me what the point is, please.
Yeah, I'll tell you the point. You see, the thing is,
yes,
if Russia is not indeed threatened or planning to annex Ukraine, you must make it clear. See, Mark, why is Russia time and again demanding non-expansion of NATO as a precursor to talks with the US? Why do you feel threatened by Ukraine? Yeah, I'm asking you. Why? I'm asking you. I want Dove to come into this debate. No. See, Mark, you're not letting me complete the question. You see, the question is this. See,
Yeah.
First
You're
of
not
all,
making a question. You're making a statement.
I must admit, Mark, and for everyone who knows how I anchor my programs, I have a natural predilection to making statements, so allow me to indulge myself a little bit more. My question is, you will call it a statement, that if Russia is not going to annex Ukraine against its will, why are you demanding non-expansion of NATO as a precursor to talks? Why?
Yes. Russia is demanding the non-expansion to NATO because NATO is the most aggressive and powerful military alliance on the planet.
So good.
If we take a look at the history of the last 3 decades, Libya, Syria, Serbia, the backing up of U.S. invasions and military occupations in Iraq, in Afghanistan, Russia has very good reasons to feel threatened by NATO and its leader, the United States, especially right on its borders. It is an existential Cuban Missile Crisis scenario for Russia.
Okay, I'd like a response from Dove, who's listening on remarkably quietly from Washington today. You know, I don't know why Cuba is brought into the mix. Mr. Zakim, you know, will the U.S. really get into a theater of war? Mark mentioned Cuba. You know, Russia is a nuclear power. Russia is a nuclear power with 6,257 nuclear warheads. What if Russia decides to reach out to its old Cold War ally Cuba and goes on to place missiles in their territory, which is barely 90 miles from the coast of Florida? What if there's a repeat? I see a hint and a suggestion of that. And please don't think I'm giving out something fantastical. What if there's a repeat of the Cuban Missile Crisis of '62?
Well, first of all, Arnab, good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Always happy to be on your show, and I don't mind in the least that you make statements that you pose as questions. Look, let's focus on what's going on now. I don't think we're going to go to war, number one. Why? Because if Biden wanted to go to war, he would have sent troops to Ukraine. He's made it clear he won't. That's number one. Number two, as you rightly point out, what the heck does NATO have to do with Ukraine? It's quite clear that there are several countries in NATO that do not want Ukraine in NATO right now and probably will oppose it. I've heard it from one Frenchman that they'll oppose Ukraine's entry into NATO for at least a decade, if not 2. So that's not at all clear. Number three, the United States and NATO did not push themselves into the Baltic states. The Baltic states wanted to join NATO. So did Romania. So did every NATO country. They wanted it. And oh, by the way, why do they want it? Because they remember the Warsaw Pact. Or in the case of the Baltic states, they remember how friendly Russia moved in and took away their independence, which is what the Ukrainians worry about. Now, I don't have to speak for Bogdan because he's going to speak for himself. But the fact is, the United States is being very, very careful. It's focusing on diplomacy. Tony Blinken's been running around the world, Secretary of State Blinken, to try to get a diplomatic solution. And what does Mr. Putin want to do? Mr. Putin wants to destroy NATO. In fact, I would argue that even more important than taking over Ukraine, with all due respect to my Ukrainian friends, he wants to destroy NATO because you know who else tried to do that? Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev. That you are watching a repeat of the worst elements of the Cold War, and the United States is being very, very restrained to the point that our Ukrainian friends say we're not doing enough for them.
Okay, Mr. Zakim, I have a 10-second response to that. Okay.
You're not asking me to respond. I just spoke.
Okay, fine. No, I'm not asking you to respond. I just tell you, I am equally flabbergasted at the trust that the Ukrainians have on the NATO. They should look at the experience of Afghanistan. I don't think anyone can trust NATO after Afghanistan. Did you forget how US and NATO allies were the first to abandon and hand over an entire country into the hands of terrorists? Why should NATO be trusted? Is my question to the Ukrainian people. But anyway, I think before I go to Kawal Sibal and our friends from China, I suspect that Mark wanted to respond to you. Mark.
Yeah, I'm a little, flabbergasted by propaganda here invoking Stalin. I mean, NATO didn't even come into existence in the 1950s. But
NATO came into existence in 1949, sir. 1949, after Stalin had occupied several. Okay, let's get our facts straight, because you're not getting them straight.
After Stalin had defeated Nazi Germany and all of the fascist European countries that had invaded the Soviet Union.
Only by himself. There was no D-Day. There was no defeat of the Nazis in the West. Oh, come on, sir.
The U.S.
Please.
and the U.K.
You want to make
contributed
an argument,
7% of Nazi casualties. They helped a little bit.
You can't even keep a straight face.
I cannot keep a straight face at your comments. It is correct.
Well, Arnab, you sure got the debate you wanted.
No, I'm just keeping a very studied silence and observing everything today. I'm observing everything today, Dove. I'd like to go across to Kawal Sibal. I'm coming to you, Mr. Nahailo. I'm going to go at the end to our friends from China. So Victor and Andrew, just coming to you for a minute. Kamal, what's happening here, Mr. Kawal Sibal? I won't ask you about the Indian position, just from your experience as a veteran diplomat. The same question I asked Elizabeth. If this gets protracted, things can go wrong, Mr. Sibal. Don't you fear that?
Yes, but why should it get protracted? That's what surprises me. After all, Putin and Biden met at Geneva, really discussed things in depth about trying to reset the relationship. After that, they have had other conversations. The U.S. Secretary of State has had conversations with Lavrov. He has visited Russia. Russia has given written documents stating what they want in terms of security guarantees, legal guarantees. The United States has said they will look at it and respond. They seem to have responded. Russia is looking at the response, and they say perhaps in a couple of weeks, Putin may take a position after his advisors have discussed in depth with him what could be the next step. So negotiations are going on. And therefore, our position is very right. Until the negotiations are exhausted and there's no meeting of minds, everybody should hold their horses and not envenom the situation and create more tensions by untimely statements about conflict and things like that. That is one. The other question I always ask myself is that if Finland and Sweden could remain out of NATO at the height of Soviet power and continue to be out of NATO even now, so why can't rational people on both sides have an understanding on Ukraine? What is the need for Ukraine to become a member of NATO? Now, remember, in Putin's 22 years almost, there have been 4 NATO extensions. Putin has reconciled himself to the Baltic states and the former East European states becoming part of NATO. He reacted when Georgia was encouraged, and he intervened. That was a signal to the United States and NATO that there are very clear red lines. And Ukraine is the reddest of line in terms of Russian security, and Putin has stated that publicly. So what is the reason for creating more tensions, sending in arms, encouraging the Ukrainian government to stand up to Russia, and
exactly.
then prevent the implementation of the Minsk agreement.
That's a question.
Where France and Germany, 2 European powers, and Europe is going to suffer the most if there is a conflict, 2 European powers who want peace and who have played a hand in trying to establish peace. But unless NATO is on board, unless US is on board, this will not happen. That's why Russia said that they must speak to United States, because United States holds the vital card and will take a decision whether ultimately NATO extension will take place or not take place.
Mr. Sibbal, Mr. Nahailov from Kiev wants to respond. Very critical question. Are we going to have a world war because Ukraine wants to join NATO? Is that big enough a reason? Why do you have to join NATO? If you claim your independence, allow me. If you claim you're independent and Russian imperialists are trying to take you over, then why are you so desperate to join NATO?
Friend, why did India want to become independent? Why didn't you stay part of the British Empire? It was good for many. Why did you? Why does Ukraine want
one
to be
second. There's no comparison here. No. One second. There's no comparison here. There's no comparison here. But the question is, you say, why did India become independent? You are independent. Are you saying you'll get independent if you join NATO?
Ukraine voluntarily gave up its nuclear missiles and had guarantees from Russia included that it would not be aggressed and it would not be, its sovereignty would not be violated. You also forget, and with all due respect to your Indian colleague, that the Russian colleague calls what happened in Kiev a coup d'etat, whatever.
No, why don't you just say? My question is, why don't you just say? And I don't know why UK, which is getting so aggressive in this, Miss Braw, why doesn't UK also, just say that okay, we'll support Ukraine. They don't need to join the NATO. They just need to say they won't ally with NATO and end it. Quell the situation. Or is Boris Johnson also inching for war, given that his own political position, like Biden, is a little bit under scrutiny these days? And his own position, every leader whose position is threatened loves a war, doesn't he? So that's why Boris Johnson, Biden probably itching for war rather. Ms. Braw.
Well, Boris Johnson is certainly in big trouble at the moment, and I fear it will cloud his judgment in one way or the other. He is clearly focused on a police investigation against him. But can I just make another point, which I think damage is already being done even without any Russian soldiers crossing the border. The Ukrainian economy is suffering. International investors are losing confidence in the Ukrainian economy. Various international indicators regarding the Ukrainian economy are going down. So really, Russia could do a lot of harm to Ukraine, even without going any further than they already are. And that is the dilemma of the moment, because Ukraine can't really do anything if no soldiers have crossed the border, and yet it's already feeling consequences. What to do, I don't know, but it is the nature of the globalized world we live in now, that so much depends on international money markets, international investors, globally operating companies, and in a way that it didn't during the Cold War, and that's where we are.
Now, Victor Gao from Beijing and Andrew Leung from Hong Kong, is China remote controlling all this? Why do so many people have a sneaking suspicion that the Chinese are fighting the Americans through Putin via Ukraine?
This is Victor Gao. I'm very happy to be joining this very important discussion. First of all, China has very good relations with Russia. China also has very good relations with the Ukraine, and we wish the Russian people very good wishes, as well as the Russian people all the good wishes. Now, I think if I advise the Ukraine people, I would say the best option for Ukraine is to achieve permanent neutrality, because it is no fun to be caught up between NATO and the United States on the one hand, and Russia on the other hand. This is a recipe for disaster for all the parties involved. So maybe of great wisdom, of great knowing yourself and knowing every party involved, and you're not talking about small countries as your neighbors, you're talking about very, very big, important strategic countries as Russia. Permanent neutrality, like, for example, Austria, Switzerland, or Sweden, and several other countries probably will be the best choice for Ukraine. But it's up to the Ukraine government and the people to decide, of course. This is my personal view. Now, we talked about Cuba. Allow me 1 minute. Let's go back to the Cuba missile crisis. At that time, the former Soviet Union was an independent sovereign country. Cuba was independent sovereign country. Soviet Union wanted to base missiles in Cuba. Cuba wanted to have the Soviet missiles in Cuba. It's completely between Cuba and the former Soviet Union. So why should the United States jump out of the seat and strongly oppose the Soviet Union's missile being stationed in Cuba? Because the United States, President Kennedy, did not feel comfortable with Soviet missiles based in Cuba. Now, if you use this logic, you will know why Russia today strongly opposes Ukraine to become a NATO member, to have NATO offensive weapons to be deployed in Ukraine. This will be a recipe for disaster for the Russian government and the Russian people. So I think for this dilemma to be broken, everyone needs to know themselves as well as the other stakeholders. And if you miss one important stakeholder, it will be, going into an abyss. So I hope we will really fully understand the complexity of the situation. Finally, allow me to say one thing. We just now mentioned Joseph Stalin. Allow me to say, Marshal Joseph Stalin was a great hero, saving mankind. Because if the former Soviet Union was defeated by Nazi Germany, or if the former Soviet Union surrendered to Nazi Germany, England or the United Kingdom would be conquered, and the United States probably would be lost. And people in the United States probably will be speaking German, and we here in China probably will be speaking Japanese. So mankind should not forget the great contribution by Joseph Stalin in rallying the Soviet people, especially the Russian people, and including the Ukrainian people, in the fight against Nazi Germany. This is a historical respect, a fact, and we in China highly admire and respect the contribution by Joseph Stalin.
Mr. Nahailo shakes his head so vigorously when you're speaking. I don't have to ask him a question. Yes, yes, Mr. Nahailo. Something that Professor Victor has said has provoked you. Can't hear you, sir.
Stalin was an before Hitler attacked him. He killed 6 million Ukrainians by hunger. He is a villain, a monster in history, right? So, okay, he was good to the Chinese when you established the system. A villain and a killer for us. Not that we were pro-Nazi. Okay. But the main thing I want to emphasize is that Russia already today has missiles on Ukrainian territory. NATO doesn't have it. The Americans don't. We don't want Russian missiles in Crimea, in eastern Ukraine, and on our other borders. And Russia has in its Cuba, part of Russia, in the Kaliningrad Oblast, it already has missiles aimed at Poland, Germany, and whatever. So what are we talking about? Please be honest and not distort the picture in a very selective manner. That's why Ukrainians are afraid. They want independence, sovereignty. They gave up their nuclear missiles under guarantees from, including Russia. And today, they want to live their own life of Euro-Atlantic structures, because that's the only thing that will give them security from a leader, Putin, who doesn't acknowledge the Ukrainians as a separate people and their right to a state. You've heard the Russian spokesman here. We have a right to that. President Wilson in 1918 spoke about the right to...
But the other way, and I found it fascinating, Andrew, that Professor Victor completely avoided my very direct question on whether China is remote controlling this. I personally think China is remote controlling this. I personally think that China is using its a considerable influence over Russia to push it in the direction of a conflict with the United States. And I personally think, Andrew, that this is about China saying to the US, the world is not going to be unipolar anymore, which you have a right to say. I too, all of us, everyone in India is also against a unipolar world, but there are ways to do it. Are you playing this chessboard using Russia as a card, Andrew? Is Russia one of your players on your chessboard, on the Chinese chessboard? Andrew? That was to you.
I don't think that China is involved in this at all. On the other hand, China is very.
But let's look at it from both sides' perspective. The prospect of Ukraine joining NATO really sparks off, as you discussed before. If missiles were placed in Ukraine, then Moscow would have only about 10 minutes notice to respond to a missile attack. And it's not just Ukraine.
I'm having an audio problem there. I'm going to come back to you in just a minute after fixing your audio. But in the meantime, I'd like to go across once again to Kamal Sibal. You know, I think both Biden and Putin are intent on war in this case. Otherwise, America is sending 80 tons, including 300 Javelin missiles for Ukraine, when none of the European countries are willing to transfer arms. I think Biden wants a small conflict. It appears Biden wants a conflict, maybe for his political reasons.
Well, I'm not too sure if that is the case, because the price that the United States and Russia and Europe in particular will pay would be long-lasting. It will weaken both Europe and United States and Russia. And since we have our Chinese friends on the panel, it will directly benefit China. Already China is the second most powerful country in the world and aspires to be number one. And the road to that is if the transatlantic alliance gets weakened, Europe gets weakened, Russia is in further disarray, and so is the United States and Europe. So I don't think, number one. Number two, Biden has more than once said that NATO is not going to intervene. Sending a few troops and arms here and there is not going to intimidate Russia. Russia can deal with this if they are pushed into that corner. So these are token steps, steps that West is taking, and it's not going to really affect the core of the situation. Therefore, the only answer is to let Europe, France, and Germany work together with Ukraine and Russia.
No, the Russians won't allow it. Mr. Sibal, Putin is too deep into this. Putin is too deep into this to pull back. My worry is every day he goes deeper into this. If he pulls back now, it's a question of his prestige. And at the end of the day, he's a politician.
No, it's not prestige. He has said very clearly two things which are very important for Russia. One, he says that, look, I cannot any further retreat now. Ukraine is the last post for me. And number two, for Russia, it is inconceivable that NATO bases get set up in the Sea of Azov and destroy the Russian naval fleet.
Yeah, but again,
these are very serious security issues for Russia.
Sure, but here's the question. Okay, let me ask our friend from Moscow. I think Putin is punching well above Russia's weight. Can Russia survive a long drawn war? Let's say Russia goes to war with NATO. Okay, Dov, let's play out this situation. Russian military might can be easily overwhelmed. Can be easily overwhelmed by the US and NATO forces if they decide to go all out against you.
Okay. First of all, I'm an American citizen. I live in Russia.
Yeah, that's all right. I'm just taking the Russian perspective. That's all right. Yeah.
Yes. Second of all, no one is talking seriously. No one who is serious is talking about Russia and NATO going to war in this situation. Joe Biden has already made clear, and NATO has made clear, that they will not be intervening in Ukraine if Russia chooses to launch, which they have not done so thus far, a military intervention in Ukraine. All right, so no one is seriously talking about that. I mean, there's always possibilities for extreme miscalculations, but Joe Biden does not intend to go to war with Russia, and Vladimir Putin does not intend to go to war with Joe Biden. That is simply something that is not realistically on the table here. Second of all, I'm a little insulted at the idea. It's rather ludicrous, the idea that Russia doesn't have legitimate interests in Ukraine, the idea that Russia is some puppet of Chinese influence. I mean,
I didn't say puppet.
Chinese colleague.
I didn't say puppet. I said Chinese have a lot of influence over you. I said Chinese have a lot of influence over Russia, huge amount of influence, and that's a fact.
I would argue that certainly the United States has far more influence over Ukraine than China has over the United States. Russia has a very good strategic partnership with China, but we also have a good
but my
strategic
question was
partnership
not
with
that.
India.
My question was, my question was in terms of positioning and perception. It's all right, Putin's been punching well over his weight, which I think is good, because Putin has really taken, despite all the economic limitations, and if I may say so, the rather disastrous Russian economy right now, he's taken Russia in terms of perception, to a different orbit. No problem about that. But, eventually it's about real military might, real economic might, the ability to sustain. I want Duff to come in on that. You have one of the world's most powerful militaries, but you have about 285,000 ground troops. You can only bring 92,000 of them, of which only 45,000 are combat troops, ultimately to bear on Ukraine. So positioning is good. But America and NATO would also know the real military and economic reality that you will have to face. So, Dub, you want to comment on that? Can Putin really get into this warlike situation? I'm sure you're playing this out in your mind. Can he do that?
Okay.
Can he do that, Dub? What do you think?
Military veterin.
I was just asked to speak. Please let me speak. Arnab asked me to speak. I think Putin would like to get whatever he can get without going to war. And I do think my personal view is he wants to slice off another part of Ukraine, because that way NATO will not stand together, and there won't be much of a response. He wants to get whatever he can get without going to war. And frankly, neither does Biden want to go to war, for very different reasons. He still has to get past the fact that a lot of people blame him for the way he got out of Afghanistan. But people are not upset that he did get out. The United States is not in a mood to go to war again. And so I think both leaders, for very, very different reasons, don't want to go to war. Now, the real question then becomes, what does Putin really want?
What does he want? Yeah.
I don't know that China, by the way, is using Putin as a puppet. On the other hand, China clearly benefits from this crisis.
How?
Because if the United States looks weak, that helps China. If NATO looks weak, that helps China. And if Putin looks stronger, that helps China, because they have a better relationship with Putin than they do with the West. So it certainly is going to help China. And in fact, it already is helping China. And let me remind you that just this past week, China, Russia, and Iran had a joint naval exercise in the Gulf of Oman. So they're pretty close, China and Russia, and we can't forget that. But I don't believe either leader wants a war.
So, yeah.
I think that Putin is hoping he can break up NATO or at least weaken it. He wants to show the United States.
But Biden is positioning. Biden was positioning. When Victoria Nuland on 27 January, she called on China to convince Russia to engage in diplomacy, also carried some kind of a veiled warning that if there is conflict, there'll be repercussions, indicating there'll be repercussions on China as well. Andrew, is China concerned?
No, I don't think they'll.
Andrew, is China concerned? Andrew KP Liu, is China concerned?
Yeah. Well, I don't think that China can convince Russia to move away from a matter of great national security. In fact, it is not in China's interest to do so either. But I think that there's been a suggestion to take the matter to the United Nations Security Council. Now, of course, if it's the motion to the table at the Security Council is to sanction Russia, then China will not support it. But if the motion is for further talks, then China would go along with it. So I think that the China's interest would be not to allow the situation to escalate. But if you look at Russia's perspective, the situation, the Ukraine issue is really a critical issue, coming as it has on the history of NATO expansion, of European Union expansion, all the states in the Russians near abroad now have all joined, mostly have joined the West. And to Russia, it's a great security risk.
Yes.
And of course, the Ukraine situation has brought the matter to a head.
Yes.
And you talk about the Russian military power. The Russian military power is no longer the military power back in 10 years ago. It is nearly on par, if not even more so, than compared with the United States. And definitely is much more powerful than the NATO forces combined.
I find this. I agree. In fact, Andrew, on one point I agree with you.
Yeah.
After what happened in August in Afghanistan, I've held the view that NATO is a dead organization. I find this most touching. NATO. What is NATO? NATO is a dead organization. Why does NATO want to move east in the first place? Elizabeth Braw, NATO is just a Cold War security pact, right? It's a desperate attempt to keep NATO relevant. So who's wanting a rekindling of a Cold War? I think it's NATO and the US. And why is UK getting so drawn into it? Doesn't Boris Johnson have his own problems with Partygate?
Boris Johnson has enormous problems with Partygate and now with the animals that the UK armed forces had to bring out of Afghanistan ahead of Afghans. But is NATO a dead organization? No, it's not. But its mission is to defend its members against aggression against those member states. So it may look dead until one of its members is attacked and then it springs into action. And I think the challenge is that everybody sees in NATO the answer to every single security dilemma. NATO is only there to protect its member states. And in the situation such as this, Ukraine is not a member state. I know it would desperately like to be one, but at the moment it's not. And so that puts NATO in a really difficult position. So clearly NATO member states want to help Ukraine, but as a non-NATO member state, it can't, it has no such guarantees. So as a result, NATO looks a little bit passive or powerless to do anything. What is the answer? Clearly, there's no answer at the moment, but NATO is not there. It's very much alive for its members, which is another reason why Sweden and Finland are beginning to look a bit more closely at NATO membership. I don't think that will happen in the near future. Nevertheless, for them, it's a viable option as well. So it's when Emmanuel Macron and others, especially him, says NATO is brain dead, I think that's just, it's a nice headline, but for the countries that depend on NATO to defend them, which are the member states, it's indispensable.
Okay, Mr. Sibal, finally, from an Indian perspective, diplomatic silence could lead to alienation. We keep saying that the government, the Modi government, is always, looks out, takes a position. Putin was in New Delhi a couple of months back. A Russia-China alliance can hurt India, right? If conflict breaks out, and we should always be prepared without undermining its ties with Russia. How do we handle things? How long do we keep hoping that nothing happens?
We remain neutral. We have nothing in the game directly. It's a fight between Europeans, between the United States and Russia, Europe and Russia. It is a fight which is totally unnecessary, and we should actually elaborate on what we have said already today.
Mr. Nahale wants to say something to you from Kiev.
Find a peaceful solution. Don't get involved. We are not directly involved. We are not going to get involved militarily.
Well, we're too large. We are too large a country and too important a country to say we're not involved.
Arnab, let me make one point. We have very good relations with the United States. We have very good relations with Russia. We have to preserve both these relationships.
Okay.
And we won't be able to do that if we take sides. The long-term impact of taking sides will be disastrous for our foreign policy.
Okay, Mr. Nahale.
Because the rights and wrongs of the situation are equally shared. At best, they are equally shared. And therefore, there is no side which is clean on this issue. Therefore, we should keep away.
That's a very nice position, very comfortable. It's called sitting on the fence. You're a member of the UN. You should be against the violation of the sovereignty.
But UN is for peace, not for encouraging war.
Fence far away is a very comfortable position. for India. If part of your territory was taken, you would be screaming to the world for it to intervene. Let's not play this role of we are far away, we are neutral. What is neutrality? Neutrality is basically copying out. Neutrality is a failure to take a position in according with international norms. And you know that very well, sir, because you are an expert. But you don't want to do that.
Okay.
And we have.
But what position has Ukraine taken on India, Pakistan, India, China issues? Please tell me.
Biden wants and what Putin wants. Ask what Ukraine wants, and that's the reason for this conflict.
Well, this is
what it wants.
Well, I don't know who's a threat to whom, but some people say the Soviet Union fell, the Warsaw Pact is finished, why is NATO still there? NATO says we've got a breath of fresh air. China says we're not doing anything for now. India says we're not going to get into this. But every single day, ladies and gentlemen, unless this is resolved in a week, it's going to get out of hand. I thank you so much. It's been a fantastic conversation. And ladies and gentlemen, what a great week it has been in terms of news. And I shall be back tomorrow with a thematic debate. Tomorrow, I'm looking at the issue of decolonization. Is it time to get rid of all Raj time relics? I think so. What do you think? Public debaters join me 9 p.m. sharp tomorrow. Till then, good night and goodbye.